It's a philosophical pursuit for me. As a matter of principle, I value individuals. I'm good with identity. I loathe tribalism. And when I look at race in particular, race, a phony concept that is dreamed up to divide us. And I find people embracing it and holding it close to them like a sacred shroud. It makes me really upset. It is not who we are. You are not your appearance. It is ridiculous. And people who happen to look like me, like, we don't have like any common bond as a consequence of just kind of sort of looking like each other. And they prove it every day when I am routinely subjected to really nasty and disgusting criticism from people on the basis of not just my appearance, but my appearance and my incongruent perspectives on any number of issues, at least as so far as they see it. It's the reason why when I've had conversations with Black Lives Matter activists, I have walked away from them under a cloud of really nasty expletives and racial epithets, and even had someone threaten to assault me physically. If I didn't have things to lose, I might have actually taken some action, but I've got things to lose. So no, it's a real pursuit. And look, Zora Neale Hurston is my lodestar so far as this perspective is concerned. I've extracted some of it from her, and it's the notion that I don't believe that we ought to have pride in things that are unearned, like race and sexuality. I don't think you should be ashamed, but having pride in it seems odd to me. I think we have pride in the things that we accomplish and the things that we do. Happenstance occurrences, I don't want you to be ashamed of the fact that you happen to be Black or the fact that you happen to be gay or any of those other things. But it seems odd for it to be about professions of pride and then for us to be so sensitive on the other side, which makes it seem like, well, it's weird that you've got so much pride, but you're also super sensitive, that you lash out at the universe anytime anyone says anything that seems like it might possibly sound like it could be racist, or homophobic, or something else. I mean, those people are weak. They have eggs as their Twitter avatars. They can't hurt us. We won. Everyone who hates racism won. I wish that we would come to terms with that victory and accept it. We didn't get to march with Martin Luther King on the mall. That is unfortunate for us. Instead, we get to inherit the world that he helped win us. One where racism, as a function of power in any meaningful sense, has been defeated. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's that it is powerless to stop us. Like, those ideas are deplorable and abhorrent, and everyone knows it. And the people who don't are losers. Literally losers.
Why don't you give it a shot and we'll see where we go.
Okay, well, I'm going to begin by disrupting the premise because my perspective, I don't have a unique theory about race and crime. I have a particular idea about race, how it divides us, obscures the truth, and generally ruins everything, which would be the subtitle to a book if I wrote one. And I apply my perspective on race to the issue of crime and social justice and criminal justice reform, which most people talk about with respect to race, because it illustrates that point really well. So, case in point, when people talk about police-involved shootings in this country, they generally talk about it with respect to race. They generally talk about the fact that Blacks are killed in a proportion that seems pretty high relative to their share of the population. But if we take a holistic look at police-involved shootings, we know that on average, there's roughly 1,000 people who die every single year in the United States in a police-involved shooting. A small number of people die who are unarmed. That's not to say those are the only shootings that we should ever be concerned about not being completely on the up and up, but some percentage of them are unarmed. Something like 60 of the 1,000 are unarmed. It's a lot smaller than most of us probably suspected. And relatedly, something like 20 of those people who are unarmed and shot and killed by the police are Black. About 30 are white. This changes the calculus pretty dramatically. Now, 20 of 60 is still like a decent number And it's still going to look a little different than the 12% share of the population that black people make up. But when it's obvious that at least as many, if not more, relative to some value, white people are killed by the police, it totally changes the dynamic of the conversation. We stop speculating about whether or not the police are killing black people because they're super duper racist, whether or not the police are just out hunting black people down, and the universe of solutions that we're likely to try to bring to bear as we're looking to curtail the number of people who get shot and killed by the police, they're going to change too, because we're no longer distracted by the notion that racism is the fundamental thing that we should be concerned about here. And I could apply, again, the same instinct about the way race causes us, and race and presumptions about racism cause us to ask the wrong categories of question in a bunch of areas related to police and criminal justice reform. And I mean, you wrote an essay for Reason some time back, which concludes with an insight that I thought was very powerful, related to the fact that if we were actually to remove all of the black people, all of the minorities from prisons in the United States would still be among the world's leaders in incarcerating human beings, which again reframes the problem completely. Is mass incarceration, is the war on drugs, are these things fundamentally about race? Kinda. There is some element of that. Historically, we know that narcotics laws have had something to do with race, but it's a practical matter. In 2019, the fact is that the impact of these laws are broadly shared across all of society, and that undoing the harm that these laws are causing, even if they're disproportionate relative to their share of the population, requires race-neutral policy that is not caught up in all of this meandering and hand-wringing that we do about racism and racial bias on the part of the police. I think that those conversations generally take us further away from scoring reform, and they ignore the broad impact of bad policy related to policing and police-involved shootings and all the rest.
I think we're good.
Instance of a white person saying to me, like, nigger, in a way that was meant to express contempt, but even that was weird. It was a young girl. I was living in Ashburn, Virginia. It was a young girl who she came out of the house, and we'd been playmates. So she's a neighbor, and I said, "Hey, what's going on? You know, can we do the thing?" And she says, "Well, my daddy says I can't play with niggers," and she seemed confused, and I was confused. And I was like, all right, well, I'll go inside. And I told my dad, and my dad talked to her dad. And this was never heard of again. And I had never really interacted with her again. That was it. That is the most obvious, explicit sort of racism I've ever encountered in my life. Most of the racism that I've encountered is essentialism. And most of it has come from black people. There have been a few white people brave enough to call me an Uncle Tom or a coon or something like that. But every other circumstance, I would just have to speculate. I can't know. I can't know if that time I got pulled over while being a passenger in an Uber where the cops were sort of active in this particular area, if they pulled me over in that car to inspect things because they could tell I was black in the dark at night before they got to the vehicle. I could presume, and in presuming, create for myself a narrative of a world in which I have to always watch my back, or I could acknowledge the uncertainty and move on, because what does it cost me to be wrong in categorizing that as not a big deal? Nothing. Gum on my shoe.
There you go. Absolutely, who lived under Jim Crow.
And
this is true.
there are I would say many more people who imagine themselves a party to the worst suffering of slavery, and who have no person who can attest to them with respect to what that was like. And I think that co-opting suffering in that way, imagining it as your own, is poisonous in a lot of different ways. I think, again, there's too much and there's too little. I think there is a point at which, when you imagine yourself, there's actually this great YouTube video of James Baldwin having a debate with firing line.
Buckley.
William F. Buckley, where he's giving this speech and he says, "I picked the cotton," and I love James Baldwin. I have a deep affection for a lot of James Baldwin's work, and I'm skeptical and critical of other aspects of it. But no, James, you didn't. That wasn't you. And I do think it's imperative to draw a distinction between ourselves and our circumstances and our unique challenges and the challenges of people who came before me. And I don't think embodying the skin of past victims in that particular way, in that context, is necessarily always helpful.
You're not a big fan of race victimhood. You're also not a fan of race pride.
Nah.
It's the other side of that, right?
Race pride in me had to go.
Other side of that
Zora
coin.
Neale Hurston. Yeah.
Talk about that. Race pride. What did Zora say about race pride?
I mean, I just gave you the most of that essay that I could excerpt that I could quote. I couldn't give you the rest of it. But the general sentiment is that accomplishments, achievements do not belong to particular classes of human, that Jews are not responsible for or a party to all of Einstein's accomplishments, and that blacks are not collectively responsible for or a party to all of Carver's accomplishments. It's a pity that she goes to Carver there. George Washington Carver,
yeah.
Fame of peanut fame. Not to ridicule the man, he's certainly smarter than me. But it's poisonous for precisely the same reason that it would be poisonous to imagine that the failing of any one black person is somehow mine, or that the failing of black people collectively is mine because we both happen to be black. It's a perverse way to go about living your life on both extremes. In conversations to prioritize them, which I should say explicitly, and I think it is fair to say that this kind of racial essentialism, the notion that certain people have the capacity for empathy with other people who kind of sort of look like them, but if you don't, then you don't also have that capacity for empathy, that everyone who kind of looks alike, or to say it, put it another way, everyone of the same race with a huge asterisk beside it, because what is that? That all of those people have some sort of shared sense of history and some shared experience in the world, which this would be cute if it were true, but it is obviously not true. Our experiences are subjective, and as such, they are individual. And generally speaking, and we mentioned this on the last release, to the extent you have this notion of blackness, you can have as many people as possible, 60 million black people, all of them are black in their own individual way, which renders the concept virtually meaningless. The fact is that once you do that, all you're left with is this weird sort of nest and patchwork of interconnected and overlapping like averages, like weird things. What is the average group propensity towards this, or what's the average height, or what's the average weight, or what's the average income? But when you break it down further, you find that the Caribbean Americans, the African Americans, like literal Africans, say from Nigeria or something, that those people have differences. That when you break it down a slightly different way, the number of books read per night to your children or something like that.
What's up, Joe Biden?
Two-parent household, for example, like they have different outcomes. There are 100,000 different ways to parse things. And the notion that you could actually say that there is a ubiquitous, universal black experience, and that is enough for you to start to say other ridiculous things, like there is a black privilege or a white privilege that is just there, an inherent sort of black disadvantage. But once you take those things and you make them part of your institution's policies, like it is part of your practice for determining who gets what role or how many people you need to have of a particular hue in order to say, we're meeting our quotas, our thresholds. Once you do that, it is functionally racist. At best, assertions about privilege and the essential nature of the black experience, these are religious claims. Like, that's fine if you believe it, but more likely, they're obviously not true because there are all of these deviations from that ridiculous theory. Like, these aren't absolute principles, and we certainly can't build or rebuild a society on them.
And to the extent that's what's driving our conversation about criminal justice reform, and oftentimes it really does feel like that's the case. I don't understand why our conversation about criminal justice reform has to emanate from disparities. I don't get it. Because if all you have are the disparities in police shootings, for example, you could have fewer shootings overall and maybe those disparities will go down, or you could have fewer black people get shot and that disparity would go down. Or you could have more white people get shot and that disparity would go down. Why is the disparity the thing and not the total number of lives saved? Does it matter less if like one additional white kid gets killed versus one additional black kid? Does it matter less? That doesn't seem right to me. I don't think the morals of that are something that any serious person actually endorses. But that is the implicit assumption. That is the value. That's the calculus that's being offered by people who are particularly and uniquely interested in the disparities. And it's not that I'm not bothered by police shootings. I'm generally bothered by it. I think it's awful. I think the framing of the conversation around those things has generally been bad. And I think that we tend to exaggerate the degree to which this is a specifically racial problem. And I think it's utterly absurd in some respects that with police involved shootings in particular, a situation where we actually have not great knowledge, but a lot of knowledge about like cop civilian deaths. It's kind of insane the degree to which we've ignored certain stories and amplified others and created, in our imagination at least, an epidemic of violence, a crusade of violence against black people that has animated all of this passion. It seems like a mass panic. Like, I don't know how else to describe it.